Hello and welcome to Introduction to Consumer Bankruptcy with Transformance. My name is Neil Israel and I will be your narrator today. Let's get started. Before we start the actual webinar, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about Transformance, which is our agency that's sponsoring our event today. Transformance is a 503c nonprofit that was started over 40 years ago, and we are a United Way provider as well as receiving our accreditation from the Council on Accreditation. We're also a HUD-approved multi-state housing and education organization. We provide counseling, education, and coaching to those individuals that need it, in addition to having multiple lines of service, which I'll talk about now. We have credit and budget coaching. That's for individuals and working families that want to learn about how to manage their money and work with an individual who can help them master that skill or get better at that skill. Financial education, which can occur in either a small group or a large group setting, and it can be in person, on the phone, or through a webinar, just learning about financial topics. Student loan counseling is really a growing area of concern. Student loans overall is a growing area of concern within the United States as we approach $1.3 trillion in student loans. With student loan counseling, we work with the debtors, with the individuals who have the student loan debt, to identify what their priorities are, what their best options are, and how they can make the best moves going forward with their student loan debt. Bankruptcy counseling is something that we also provide, and we'll be talking about quite a bit about today, and we'll help you learn about that. Just to provide some more information about Transformance and what we do, Transformance is really geared, we're really focused on helping individuals make it from the lower class into the middle class. And the way that we've patterned ourselves to do that is by working with organizations from social services to government to nonprofit, within technology, within education, and within the business sector, to offer programs and education and really get out there to touch the community, to work with the community. And we focus our efforts around a concept called economic empowerment. And the way we define economic empowerment is essentially through three stools. One stool being financial education, which we're experts at. The second stool being workforce development, which is helping people learn new skills to be able to get jobs and helping people find those jobs. And the third being social services. And one great example of that is Services of Hope, which is an organization that we're co-located with that can help people with utilities, payments, and also will help in certain times with rent assistance as well. So those three types of organizations, social services, workforce development, and financial education, we believe together can drive economic empowerment within the community, and that is our goal. That's what we do at Transformance. And I'd like to now tell you a little more about how our agency helps individuals reach financial stability through the story of one of our clients. Ben came to Transformance several years ago after experiencing an expensive divorce. He was living out of his car rather, and showering at the Y and using his credit cards to make all of his payments, so really kind of struggling to get by. After he came to Transformance, he signed up for our debt management program and also some of our budgeting classes. Through Transformance's budgeting classes, Ben was able to learn how to live within a budget, and through our debt management plans, Ben was able to pay off his creditors in a responsible and reasonable fashion. After learning how to budget and clearing up his credit issues, Ben went on to become a leader of his community and run several successful businesses. So Ben's example really goes to show that we help guide people that are at critical points of their lives, because money and finances is such a critical issue. We are not by any stretch responsible for outcomes, and we don't claim to be. Ben, in this case, was 100% responsible for his outcomes. So let's talk about our webinar today. Welcome to Introduction to Consumer Bankruptcy, or Introduction to Consumer Bankruptcy. In this webinar, we'll review the following topics: the coach in bankruptcy, pre-filing versus debtor education sessions, Chapter 7 bankruptcy, Chapter 13 bankruptcy, and general topics and tools. In the coach in bankruptcy, we really talk about what the role is of our coaches and our agency in bankruptcy, because it was only just 10 years ago, essentially, that laws changed and it became true that you had to get counseling, credit counseling, in order to claim bankruptcy. So we talk a little bit about what that actually means. Then we talk about pre-filing versus debtor education session, which is the two types of counseling at the different times in the process. Then we talk about the two different types of consumer bankruptcy, or individual and business bankruptcy, Chapter 7 and Chapter 13. And then we talk about some general topics and tools that can help you or help your clients as they are considering or entering into bankruptcy. So first, a definition. Bankruptcy allows individuals and businesses eliminate or repay some of their debt under protection of federal bankruptcy court. I think the key thing there is that the individuals that are filing bankruptcy are doing a few things. First, they're saying, hey, we can't cover these bills that we've amassed. It's too much money, and based on the income that we're making today, it's not something that I can not even comfortably, it's not something that I can do. But second, I'm looking for assistance from the government in terms of pulling this off and working with my debtors who are wanting to, or my creditors rather, who are wanting to make me pay up, and I need your help in making a plan. So that is, I think, very telling with the definition of bankruptcy. So now let's talk a little bit about the process steps. The first step essentially is that a consumer or business wants to explore bankruptcy, and the reason why I call that step out is that it is a milestone that has to be achieved, is the credit counseling before they can even file. So a consumer or business wants to explore bankruptcy. That consumer or business identifies the local EAUS certified credit counselor. And the way that they do that is they go onto the EAUS website, which is part of the Department of Justice, and they identify local credit counselors. Now, Transformance is eligible in over 60 areas to provide credit counseling. So once the consumer business has found a local credit counselor, they reach out to the counselor, and then the agency provides counseling to the client. If bankruptcy is wanted by that client, the client receives an EAUS certificate. Within 180 days of receiving that certificate, the client files for bankruptcy. The next step is that the consumer or business completes a pre-discharge debtor education counseling session. So that's that second follow-up session that can, in this case, be done by Transformance. Then we would in turn provide them with a second certificate indicating their completion, and they turn around and submit that to the court to have their debts discharged. So that's the whole end-to-end process, where the consumer has first gotten a certificate to say they've thought about their options and they believe that bankruptcy is the best option because although it's the most extreme, it's the one that makes the most sense to them. And then, okay, now that they've decided to take the step of claiming bankruptcy, here's some things that they need to start to think about again, or some reminders about responsible financial behavior that they need to think about as they get their feet back on the ground and begin to rebuild their financial story, if you will. So pre-filing and debtor education courses and education can be done in many different ways, but through Transformance, it primarily happens in the ways that we're showing here. From pre-filing, we have face-to-face and telephone counseling or coaching, and that can be done. A client will call us and we will provide that counseling. Through online, there is a website called startfresh.com, www.startfresh.com, where the process is initiated through StartFresh. The eHouse counselor is found through StartFresh, and that's how that gets started. But then Transformance kind of takes it from there. The overall administrative piece is still managed through StartFresh, but the relationship with the client themselves is actually handled by Transformance. Then through debtor education, and that is a class called Money in Motion, and that is handled through really primarily telephone, but in theory it could also be face-to-face if we had a number of people that wanted it. We provide that debtor education for the second certificate that's required by eOust. Okay, so let's talk more about what do those sessions actually look like. Talking about the pre-filing session and the pre-filing financial counseling. The first kind of 3 steps are the budget review, recommendations, and financial picture. And for the budget review, that's really just looking at the overall, how does the client decide what they're going to spend money on? What's their spending plan? How are they budgeting their money on a monthly basis? For the second item, when we say recommendations, what we're really talking about is for the client, are there referrals that we can provide to the client for things or problems or issues or concerns that can be handled well by agencies outside of our agency that we just can't handle as well. So it's really recommendations or referrals. And then financial picture, that's more global than budget review. What are the assets and debts, liabilities, and income? What's the bigger picture when it comes to this client's financial situation? So on the second slide regarding the pre-filing counseling, now's the time, after you've gathered the information about their financial situation, to talk to them about our lines of service. So we can say we have a DMP program that they might be interested in, where honestly it's very similar to Chapter 13 bankruptcy, so that could be something very attractive to them. And really going to the creditors, that's another potential option, and talking to them and working with them directly might be an option before you would want to do bankruptcy. What you really want to do is take whatever options the client thinks are potentially okay, potentially something that they can live with, and put them side by side and say, what's the best option if I compare them across the board? We're going to look at level of effort, cost, benefit. One thing you do want to do is dissuade the client from predatory lending. And as we all know, especially in the city of Dallas, there are a lot of predatory lenders out there. So that not only will put them in more debt and they'll be in a more detrimental situation than they're in today. And at this point, I mean, they're in financial straits because they're looking at claiming bankruptcy. So that kind of handles the second piece of the counseling interview. The next piece is what you kind of show them in terms of what they need to know. First of all, full awareness is the key, because the last thing that you want is for this person to leave the interview and be completely shocked by what happens when they file bankruptcy. They're going to have hits to their credit. They're going to have hits to their credit report. And the information related to a bankruptcy is public record. So they shouldn't be shocked when that any of those things occur. The other thing to keep in mind is that if they want to rent an apartment, it's gonna be difficult probably for at least a little while as they begin to establish credit and potentially take out a secure credit card that might begin to reduce, but in the very, very immediate, it will probably be difficult for them to rent an apartment. One thing to keep in mind, though, and to make sure that the client keeps in mind, is if when you, in the previous exercise, if bankruptcy really looked like it was the most advantageous option because of what it provided, remind the client of intermediate success versus longer term success. Yes, perhaps they'll have public knowledge of their bankruptcy, but in the long term, is that big of a deal when they're working towards a goal and the goal of financial solvency isn't achieving that better than the shame of avoiding the value of avoiding shame because somebody knows that you claim bankruptcy. So just something to consider, that you want the client to consider if they're turned off by the public record aspect. In the final part of the pre-file session, it's time to begin talking about the plan of attack or the action plans. Having taken the steps to potentially consider the bankruptcy and then learning the basics, what does a client want to do now? You begin building the bridge to the future and making the next appointments. Now, of course, is the time also for the initial EOS certificate. What is really, really important is to make sure that the client is crystal clear that they have to file within 180 days. And if there was a couple that filed, they have to get separate certificates. If the client does not file within 180 days, a new certificate can't just be printed up. They actually have to go through the process, the session again. So it's very, very important that they understand that. But again, the key thing here, the key takeaway from this slide is that it's time to build action plans. It's time to look at what the next steps are, the short-term, intermediate-term, and long-term steps are to putting the bankruptcy plan in play. So now let's talk about the pre-discharge education. Pre-discharge education really focuses on what needs to be learned by the client through the bankruptcy process as they're getting their feet back on the ground, and things that they probably knew at some point, but it's a good thing to think about again because somewhere along the way maybe they lost that knowledge. And required topics include developing a budget, using credit wisely, managing money, and managing additional resources. Of course, you can layer on that several more topics that have to do with the fundamentals of responsibly managing money and doing so in this day and age of computers and the internet and so many different options out there. This meeting is typically 2 hours in length, And like we talked about before, at Transformance, this is done either via telephone or in person. So now that we've talked about the pre-filing and debtor education types of bankruptcy education sessions, let's talk a little bit more now about the different types of bankruptcies for consumers and some businesses. Chapter 7 and Chapter 13. So there's some key concepts in Chapter 7 bankruptcy that we'll talk about now. The first is a trustee. A trustee is an individual who is appointed by the U.S. trustee and is responsible for first kind of managing the process of identifying what is an exempt versus a non-exempt asset. And those non-exempt assets are the assets that the debtor has that can be sold and seized, sold, and liquefied in order to raise money for the creditors. So obviously that's pretty important. They also can they also are responsible for conducting the 341 meeting, which is the meeting between the creditors and the debtor. And that's the essential pieces of the role of the trustee. An automatic stay stops creditors from collecting or taking action against a property. Creditors can push back as long as they do it within 30 days of the bankruptcy trial. If the client claims bankruptcy twice within 12 months, the automatic stay might be limited, and an automatic stay is not allowed for co-debtors. So it has to be on the person that's claiming bankruptcy. For Chapter 7, there is a means test. Clients whose household income is below the median for their state may file Chapter 7, if not possibly 13. However, if they don't make the basic means test, but they have extenuating circumstances and can make an argument why they should be able to claim bankruptcy, they could still make that argument to the court, but probably would want to do that with an attorney. And that's not something that we would give guidance on, but would be something that perhaps we could recommend Texas Legal Services, somebody that could help them in exploring whether or not they'd be able to claim Chapter 7 if they don't, by the rule of law, pass the means test. Okay, the next is petition requirements. So the key thing for the petition requirements is statement of financial affairs with a schedule under oath. Also have to include have a file of payment receipts or records for the past 60 days of payments to that client that client has received. So there's a lot of rules that exist as to where a client can file their bankruptcy. The basic rule is where they've lived for the last 2 years, but if that's not, if the person has moved around, the key ruling is wherever they've lived for the majority of the last 180 days. So that's key. And then the other thing from a location perspective is there are federal bankruptcy laws, but there are also state bankruptcy laws. So, or state bankruptcy exemptions and federal bankruptcy exemptions. So those can go back and forth in terms of sometimes states will sometimes federal will actually allow the states to be applied, but most often it'll be the federal that's applied, but it's not hard and fast. So that's something, again, that you're going to want to direct the client to take up with their lawyer, because, you know, if it's non-exempt, then they're gonna lose the property. So that is something that they definitely want to work with their attorney on. Okay, the next item is taxes. For Chapter 7, the client has to provide their tax returns, but Another thing to know is that a taxing authority can cancel the bankruptcy procedure based upon if that client is in default of their taxes and is in serious problems with the IRS or the state taxing authorities. Reaffirmation agreement. A reaffirmation agreement is an agreement to pay debt that would otherwise have been discharged. A good example is an agreement to keep a house or car. The agreement has to happen within 30 days of the basic implementation of the bankruptcy agreement. However, the judge is responsible for determining whether or not an individual is able to handle the undue hardships. But the two sides, for lack of a better word, are working together at that point, but it's the judge that is able to say, okay, this is a good idea, and this is something that would not cause undue hardship to either you or your family, so I'm going to let this happen. A discharge is an order entered by the bankruptcy court that prohibits creditors from taking action against an individual to collect their pre-bankruptcy debts. There are certain exemptions, including marital, legal, cosigner debts are not dischargeable. Individuals can only receive one Chapter 7 discharge every 8 years, and 6 years can occur between a Chapter 13 discharge and a Chapter 7 discharge. And on an upcoming slide, we've got a table that shows how exactly the timeframes work on that. But looking now at Chapter 13 bankruptcy, having covered some of the key things for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, Chapter 13 bankruptcy is also known as the wage earner plan, and that's where the clients have to pay back the funds that they owe over 3 to 5 years. There is a very limited role for the trustee because they're not responsible for managing the exempt versus non-exempt status of the assets. There are pre-filing and debtor education sessions within Chapter 13. Also important to note that a discharge is granted for all debtors who fully pay their creditors. A discharge is possible for debtors who make the best efforts to pay their creditors but are unable to for an unforeseen reason that they can actually speak to and explain. In this next slide, Chapter 13, we kind of cover some basic points. One, the trustee, as we said, does not take charge of liquidation of non-exempt assets. The 341 meeting is similar for Chapter 13 and Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Because the client's responsible for paying the debt back, of course, one of the requirements is that they have an income, which makes sense, of course. From a total debt perspective, the client has to have less than $307,675 in unsecured debt and can have no more than $1.2 million in secured debt in order to enter into this agreement. And from a finances perspective, the timeline of the implementation will be 3 or 5 years based on the client's discretionary income. And of course, the more discretionary income the client has, the more likely it'll be that 3 years is what's selected. From an automatic stay perspective, it works very similar to Chapter 7 bankruptcy, except co-debtor stays are allowed, whereas that was not the case with with Chapter 13. Creditors can still object to Chapter 7 or Chapter 13 bankruptcy if they don't believe that an automatic stay is valid. Taxes on Chapter 13 bankruptcy, they must be current for 4 years. Except that in this similar Taxes are handled similarly between Chapter 13 and Chapter 7 bankruptcy, except that the court might give the client additional time to make their taxes current, upwards of 120 days, to get their taxes current with Chapter 13 bankruptcy. Some general guidelines on both meetings for pre-filing and pre-discharge. The client completes required counseling or education. Counselor issues certificate, and the client files the certificate with the court. On this next slide, on the next table rather, I included a table that kind of listed the time frames for when you can submit a new bankruptcy case. So I'm going to just pause for a second and let everybody kind of take this in and copy it down if you want. I'll give you a minute. One thing I also wanted to mention is that Transformance has a tool called Pocket Change USA, and it is an e-learning and mobile learning platform that helps individuals to manage their managed plans. And this is something that could be very helpful for individuals that are entering into bankruptcy or thinking about changing behavior as they change behavior to avoid or get better after starting bankruptcy. Pocket Change USA is definitely a positive tool to use. I do want to thank you very much for joining Introduction to Consumer Bankruptcy from Transformance. And again, you can visit our website at www.transformanceusa.org, or you can always call us at 1-800-249-2227. That's 1-800-249-2227. My name is Neil Israel, and again, I want to thank you very much.